Wow. Good afternoon, everybody. I have to thank the organizers, Richard, the Explorers Club, and Manuel from Expanding, and of course our host, the AÇORES, and all the other organizations that help put this together. It's a real privilege for me to be sharing this stage and indeed this room with such accomplished and interesting people. So I have good news and bad news. The good news is, although the program says I only have 10 minutes, I've been given special dispensation to go a bit long. Since I'm the only thing between you and lunch, you may think that's the bad news. But the bad news is actually that I've got a lot to talk about and not very much time. So this is probably going to feel like speed dating a little bit. So I encourage you to swipe right and hang on. I will talk about the Ax-1 mission, but I want to put it in context. And to do that, I have to talk about the Axiom Space ambitions, which in short is to build a commercial space station. You've heard a lot about the International Space Station today, and it is an amazing vehicle, unique in history, and one of the most accomplished, one of the greatest accomplishments I think humanity can point to. But it's a machine, and one day it'll wear out, and we want to have a place to go when that inevitably happens. And so Axiom Space wants to build a commercial platform to do some of the same work that's going on there, on the ISS today, but also to expand the envelope of activities that can be done in microgravity in low Earth orbit to, in fact, help create an economy there in low Earth orbit. So our goal to build this space station is really three phases. The first one is these private astronaut missions, which I'll talk more about at the end. But our customers there are private astronauts, so these are generally self-funded individuals, professional government astronauts, so these are people that are representing their governments, researchers who don't necessarily fly to space, although they can, but they can send their research along with these private and professional astronauts. And really the purpose of this is for us to get used to working with NASA and the other four agencies involved in the ISS and vice versa, because at one point, as you'll see, we'll be operating together with the Axiom segment will effectively be a piece of the ISS. So the second phase is we are going to be attaching several modules to the front of the ISS. This is an agreement that we've had in place with NASA. Those modules are being built as we speak. First two, which are roughly identical, are being built in Italy, by Thales Space Italia. They'll come to Houston to be integrated with the avionics and then launched from American soil on a rocket. First launch is scheduled for the end of 2024, and by the end of 2025, we want to have all three of the first modules, which I'll kind of go quickly through. Anybody familiar with the ISS? These first two modules are basically a node structure, but stretched out. They'll each have 4 radial docking ports, or berthing ports more accurately, and then 2 axial ports. They have their own navigation and guidance capability, so they will get themselves to hover next to the ISS, much like cargo vehicles do today, and then they'll be robotically attached using the robot's arm. The first to the front of node 2, the second one to the front of that, and then the third one will be attached to the side. We chose to change the layout a little bit. The modules in the ISS are segments that are cross-cut axially, so they become bays as you go forward and aft in the module, and we chose to go more longitudinally. This is interesting for those of you that have been to space because it's the human body wants to know which way is up and which way is down. In fact, if you've noticed some of the imagery before, all the writing is oriented in a certain way. The lights are on the ceiling. We're really playing around with this, but from just a physical space layout capability, this actually gives us the ability to put more stuff in the same tube, if you will. This is a sample of a crew quarters. The first 2 modules will each have 4 crew quarters, so berthing for 4, life support for 8, each of them, so we have a lot of redundancy built in. And they all have very large Earth-facing windows. Philippe Starck, the famous French designer, helped with the interior design of these things. And this is the third module, which is the research and manufacturing facility. It's actually a repurposed MPLM. So these three modules were built during the space shuttle era to put in the cargo bay full of stuff, be taken to the ISS, emptied, filled with trash, put back in the cargo bay and come home. One of them is now permanently on board the ISS. The other two are on the ground. We want to take one of them and outfit it as so there's no habitability in there. It's just a place to do research. And you can see this kind of maintains the old style rack layout, and the purpose of that is to make it be back compatible with some of the research being done on the ISS. This is an amazing idea. It's, if you've seen these pictures out of the cupola, which is nadir facing on the ISS today, this is the same idea but on steroids. As you can see, it's quite large, more than 2 meters, I guess I'd call it high, and about the same in diameter, and it will be part of the third launch package. And here you see the first 3 modules attached with that Earth Observatory on the bottom. Finally, and this does not have a firm schedule yet because it depends a lot on when the ISS is determined to be deorbited, we will launch the power and thermal module. So we're attached to the ISS, we're getting electricity and cooling capability. We could do it on our own, but having more solar arrays on the ISS is a very complicated thing, and so we'd rather avoid that until the last minute. We'll launch this, attach it, and then stand ready to detach when the time comes. This also has an airlock to be able to afford extravehicular activity capability. And so here's the sequence and the dates. And here's the final configuration right before we separate. And then, of course, that leads to phase 3, where we do separate and we become a commercial destination for private astronauts, spacefaring agencies from other countries, researchers, and you name it, movie makers, advertisers, a lot of things that are not possible to be done on the ISS today. So let me go back to phase 1 and talk about Ax-1. An amazing adventure. We were supposed to be in space for 10 days, 8 of them on the ISS. Turned out to be a little bit longer for weather. But this is our crew. Left to right, Mark Pathy, Canadian, Larry Connor, an American, and on the right side is Eitan Stibe, an Israeli. All of these people went through quite a bit of training. They are loath, as are we, to call them tourists. These are not space tourists. I think there is a valid sector in human spaceflight for space tourism. The suborbital flights, I think, come to mind, but this is not what this is about. These guys all brought very meaningful science from organizations that they reached out to, brought that to the ISS, and were very, very busy during our time on orbit. So Mark worked with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, with the Montreal Children's Hospital, Larry with the Mayo and Cleveland Clinics, Eitan through an organization called the Ramon Foundation, named after Elon Ramon, who tragically was killed on the Columbia accident in 2003. They put out a broad call for experimentation in Israel, and he has become an absolute icon in that country because of the research and his research mission called Rakia. In another of the unending advertisements for Zero-G, we did our first training in May of 2021. I don't think I need to explain what this is about, but what an amazing experience, and I'll add to that advertising and just say that if you ever get the chance to experience this sensation of floating, whether it's for 30 seconds or obviously infinitely if you're in low Earth orbit, it is amazing. We went from micro-G to macro-G in a centrifuge, so we were able to follow the G profile of the launch vehicle, the SpaceX Crew Dragon, during launch, during entry, even post-splashdown with the waves that we might expect, and then a couple of abort scenarios. This is at the NASTAR facility, which is just outside Philadelphia. Then we went through a sort of NASA-inspired training, and I say inspired because NASA has used it for many, many years. It's called the National Outdoor Leadership School. basically the principle is they take you and put you in a miserable environment to bring out bad behavior. And it's very effective, and it seems like the more miserable, the more tightly bonded the crew becomes. And I can tell you that with just a few exceptions, the training on the zero-G and the centrifuge being one, we had really spent no time together. And these people are complete strangers to each other. We spent about a week this is a Talkeetna Range in Alaska, being miserable. It was every form of precipitation known to man. And I'll tell you what, we came out the other end as a very well-bonded crew. We started training on ISS systems. Of course, you have to know how to use a toilet, how to feed yourself, how to sleep, roll up your sleeping bag, etc. But the most important thing is emergency training. So the three things that are bad that can happen to you are depressurization, a fire, or a toxic atmosphere, which is caused by ammonia, which is a cooling fluid on the external cooling system leaking into the cabin. It's extremely dangerous. So here we're using handheld mock-ups of monovacuumeters, which is a Russian pressure gauge, basically, with stopwatches. And this is a backup to the automated system, but we need to be able to know how to manage and see how much time we have left. And then the other two involve generally scurrying to your launch vehicle with a mask on and waiting to see if the atmosphere is indeed toxic or if we can isolate and fight the fire. We did quite a bit of training on the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon systems. Amazing vehicle. My last mission was on a Soyuz, 1960s era. So I compare it to going from a Tesla to a Lada. From a Lada to a Tesla. It's really, having flown on the space shuttle as well, all of the information that on the space shuttle we had to cobble together with a network of laptop computers, because the computing power on the space shuttle computers was, wait for it, 512 kilobytes. So we had to put this crazy network together to do things like rendezvous and when we were using robotic operations, and it's all beautifully and seamlessly integrated in the Crew Dragon. So here we're getting closer. I think Katie showed this picture before, but this is a crew equipment interface test. So basically, we get to put on our flight spacesuits and look at get in our flight capsule, which we had not seen to that point. This is down at the Cape. We were the third crew to fly in this capsule. It was the first human Crew Dragon. That was called Demo 2, and then Crew 2, which is the second NASA mission, and then we flew on it. This is it now after we've been inside, being integrated into the Falcon 9, kind of looking down. The black part is part of the trunk, but that's also the solar arrays that provide electricity when you're in there. And then it gets rolled out horizontally to the launch pad and then erected vertically. And I'll tell you, it's a pretty amazing sight to see what has happened to Pad 39A. This is the place from which Apollo 11 launched. I think Katie and I launched on it on STS-73, and now it looks quite a bit different. So launch morning comes, we head out to the pad. Everybody's pretty excited, I have to say. The launch experience, very difficult to describe. It is, it's the thrill of a lifetime. I mean, there is so much acceleration. You just can't believe how much force is being pushed in your back for how long. So I did some math. If you take the acceleration of an F1 Formula One car from 0 to 100 miles an hour, and you can integrate the acceleration that we feel on the going into orbit over those 8.5 or 9 minutes, there's actually more acceleration per unit time in that than there is in that F1 car. About 19 hours later, we docked to the ISS. I would say spending that time in the Dragon was not uncomfortable, and it's not a terribly ergonomically favorable place, but it's absolutely fit for the job. The rendezvous is generally automated. It's supposed to be, and in our case, it worked flawlessly. And then we docked to I think we were the first crew to dock to the Zenith docking port on Node 2. And then we got to work. I can tell you, from a personal standpoint, I had been to the space station 15 years before. I'd spent 7 months commanding Expedition 14. The ISS had changed a ton. It was twice as big, at least. The crew was not 3 like it was when I was on board, but rather 7, plus the 4 of us. And so it was in some ways a very different place, but it was also a very familiar feeling. And I liken it to when you go and visit your parents in the house that you grew up in. They may have remodeled it a little bit, but it kind of feels like it's very familiar to you. And then we got to work. I just want to go through a little bit of the science that was done, and we had over 25 experiments, over 100 hours of experimentation in the time that we were docked, which is a lot compared to what a government astronaut could do, just because, of course, they have to exercise, they have other duties to maintain the space station, et cetera. Aton made some lenses by taking a liquid polymer and injecting it into a circular frame, and then letting it cure under ultraviolet light. And these lenses, obviously this is a kind of a tech demonstration thing, but it's a brilliant concept when you think about it. You can put just a little bit of liquid so that it actually comes together just, so you have a very concave lens, or you can put a lot of liquid and it'll be the opposite, right? It'll be bulging and you have a convex lens. So this has applications for making microscopes, telescopes in orbit without having to bring them already done on the ground. Larry here is also working in the life sciences glove box. He had some stem cells that were part of an experiment called Heart Health and Aging, and he spent a lot of time with syringes squirting media into these live cell chambers for later analysis on the ground. Mark did the very first two-way holoportation from space. This is a Canadian medical company that is looking at doing remote medicine, and obviously the application is you can have a doctor or physician or even a surgeon on one side in a clinical environment working in the field, acting almost like he's there. But we did take some time to look out the window. The spectaculars views from the cupola are really second to none. The cupola wasn't there the last time I was there, and it's a real treat. The colors, I think both Nicole and Katie showed some amazing pictures of what the Earth looks like from space. I won't go into much detail. We had some fun with playing with food and doing stupid astronaut tricks, as we call them. Aton loved being up there. He was like a kid in a candy store the entire time. And after quite a few delays, we splashed down just off the coast of Jacksonville in Florida. The vehicle is picked up by the recovery ship, put on the deck, and so you never get wet. Nice part. And here we are just emerging after the capsule, probably 45 minutes after splashdown. So it was a very significant, I think, moment in commercial human spaceflight. It was a very strong step toward doing science and research on orbit, but done by people who chose that research instead of being handed, like a government astronaut usually is, the experiments to do. Another advantage is that science, most of it flew with us. So as a former crew member, I know that I trained on a lot of payloads that either didn't make it in time for my increment or had been already done by the time I got there. But in this case, it's very real time, so you get to actually have the hands on the things that you were expecting to do. But I think more importantly, we are trying to democratize space. And I know that it sounds a little disingenuous to say that paying tens of millions of dollars is a democratic process, but we have to start somewhere. Back a century ago, only very, very wealthy people could fly on commercial airplanes, and now most of us came here on one, and I don't think that we're all of the same caliber of wealth as those a century ago. And so we expect that trend will occur. But it's not only for the people who go to space, it's also for the researchers on the ground. If it's a very difficult task to get science through the NASA bureaucracy, and I assume the same is true for ESA and the other agencies, and yet these folks were able to choose their own, or they can choose from a pool of, I would say, less bureaucratic process that Axiom can shepherd them through and get them certified to fly aboard the ISS. And of course, once the modules are attached, and ultimately when we separate, it'll be a completely different environment in terms of what can be done beyond, the sort of, I think, appropriate limits that the government has on its activities, things like not being able to advertise or really focusing on what I would call mostly fundamental research. The field is wide open. It can be more research, it could be tech demonstration, but it can also be not only demonstrating how you could, let's say, manufacture something in space, but manufacturing it and making money, making a profit. At the end of the day, we want to build a low Earth orbit economy, and for that we need supply and demand. Right now the supply is, I should say the demand is mostly government institutions doing research. So we have to open up the aperture and look at other lines of business, and we're very actively doing that. I think that was pretty quick. Be happy to take any questions afterward. In the meantime, bon appétit and thank you.